Let me ask you something that cuts deeper than most people are willing to admit. Why is it that the more effort you give, the more your presence seems to become expected? Why do some people barely notice your value when you're always there, yet the moment you step back, they suddenly start paying attention? It's a difficult reality to accept. Many spend months, sometimes years, trying to earn appreciation, only to discover that their absence creates more impact than all their attention ever did. The Stoics recognized this pattern long before modern psychology gave it a name. They understood that people often overlook what feels guaranteed and only recognize its value when it is no longer certain. But this is not really about making someone miss you. It is about something far more important. It is about reclaiming ownership of your own mind. Because the moment your peace depends on someone else's attention, your freedom begins to shrink. And the moment you take that peace back, everything begins to change. What appears to be a story about rejection is often a story about dependence. What appears to be a loss is often the beginning of clarity. The question is not why someone failed to see your value. The deeper question is why their recognition became necessary in the first place. And once you begin exploring that question honestly, you may discover that walking away was never about leaving someone else behind. It was about finding your way back to yourself. Most people misunderstand what it means to walk away. They see it as a reaction, a final move designed to make someone feel guilty, regretful, or ashamed. From the outside, it can certainly look that way. Someone stops calling, stops reaching out, stops investing the same energy they once gave so freely. The natural assumption is that this distance is meant to send a message. Yet the deeper truth is often much quieter than that. Walking away is rarely about changing another person's behavior. It is about changing your relationship with your own mind. It begins the moment you realize how much of your emotional energy has been tied to something you cannot control. The attention of another person starts to feel like a resource you must constantly monitor. A reply arrives and your mood lifts. A reply doesn't arrive and your mind starts searching for answers. Small shifts become major events. Tiny details become evidence. Before long, your peace is no longer rooted within you. It is being negotiated by circumstances outside your control. This is why the experience becomes so exhausting. The mind was never meant to function as a surveillance system, constantly searching for signs of approval or rejection. Yet many people find themselves trapped in exactly that pattern. They wake up thinking about someone's response. They go through their day wondering how they are perceived. They replay conversations, examine tone, and search for meanings that may not even exist. The attention that could have been directed toward growth, purpose, or meaningful action becomes consumed by interpretation. What makes this cycle especially dangerous is that it often disguises itself as care. It feels like investment. It feels like loyalty. It feels like commitment. But beneath those noble labels, there can be something else entirely. Dependence, attachment, a growing belief that emotional stability depends on receiving something from another person. Once that belief takes hold, freedom quietly begins to disappear. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology gave it different names. They recognized that suffering often begins when people confuse what belongs to them with what does not. Your thoughts belong to you. Your actions belong to you. Your judgments belong to you. The opinions, choices, and behavior of others do not. Yet people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to influence things that were never theirs to control in the first place. That effort creates tension because reality refuses to cooperate. No amount of worry can force another person to appreciate you. No amount of overthinking can guarantee loyalty. No amount of emotional investment can secure outcomes that depend on someone else's decisions. The more a person fights this reality, the more frustrated they become. The more they accept it, the more peaceful they become. Acceptance is not surrender, and it is not weakness. It is a deliberate recognition of where genuine power begins and where it ends. Something interesting happens when that recognition starts to settle into the mind. The urgency begins to fade. The constant need to know what someone is thinking loses its grip. Situations that once felt overwhelming become easier to observe without immediately reacting to them. The mind becomes quieter, not because life has suddenly become perfect, but because attention is no longer scattered across endless possibilities and imagined outcomes. There is a difference between caring about someone and becoming emotionally dependent on their responses. One comes from strength, the other comes from fear. Strength allows you to appreciate connection while remaining grounded within yourself. Fear convinces you that your emotional well-being depends on maintaining that connection at all costs. When fear takes control, people often abandon their own standards, ignore their own needs, and tolerate situations they would normally recognize as unhealthy. The difficult part is that letting go can feel uncomfortable at first. The mind becomes accustomed to certain patterns. Even painful patterns can create a sense of familiarity. When those patterns disappear, there is often a period of adjustment. Silence feels unfamiliar. Distance feels unfamiliar. The absence of constant emotional stimulation can create a strange sense of emptiness. Many people interpret this discomfort as proof they are making the wrong decision. In reality, it is often evidence that they are finally breaking a habit that has controlled them for far too long. Not every uncomfortable feeling is a warning. Sometimes it is simply the mind adapting to a healthier way of functioning. Growth rarely announces itself with comfort. More often, it arrives disguised as uncertainty. As that uncertainty begins to settle, another realization emerges. Much of what felt like connection was actually preoccupation. Much of what felt like devotion was actually fixation. Once the emotional fog begins to clear, people often see things that were hidden before. They notice how much time they spent seeking reassurance. They notice how often they neglected their own priorities. They notice how many decisions were influenced by a desire to avoid disappointment. These observations are not meant to create guilt. They create awareness. Awareness changes everything because it allows a person to step outside the cycle instead of remaining trapped inside it. What once seemed automatic becomes visible. What becomes visible can be changed. That is where the real power of walking away reveals itself. It creates space. Space to think, space to reflect, space to remember who you were before your attention became consumed by someone else's choices. The constant noise begins to lose volume. The emotional dependence begins to loosen its grip. The mind starts returning to itself. In that quiet space, a person often discovers something they have not felt in a very long time. Clarity, not the kind that arrives through endless analysis, but the kind that emerges when analysis finally stops. Clarity that comes from seeing reality as it is, rather than as you hoped it would be. And once that clarity appears, a deeper question naturally follows. If reclaiming your own attention creates this much strength, why do so many people find it so difficult to let go in the first place? If reflections like these help you see yourself and the world more clearly, consider subscribing. Stoicism is not about collecting ideas, it is about practicing them, and sometimes a single insight, applied consistently, can change the direction of an entire life. If that journey toward greater clarity, discipline, and self-mastery matters to you, subscribing is a simple way to continue walking that path. This is why people often remain in situations that drain them. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. There is comfort in knowing what tomorrow will look like, even if tomorrow looks exactly like yesterday. The mind prefers certainty. It prefers patterns. It prefers predictable disappointment over uncertain change. That may sound strange at first, but human behavior repeatedly confirms it. People tolerate neglect they would never recommend to someone else. They accept treatment that slowly diminishes their confidence. They remain emotionally attached to circumstances that leave them feeling exhausted rather than fulfilled. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering that feels familiar can seem easier to manage than stepping into the unknown. The unknown asks for something difficult. It asks us to trust ourselves. The Stoics understood this tendency with remarkable clarity. They knew that people often create prisons out of habits, beliefs, and attachments, then mistake those prisons for safety. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself that discomfort was not an enemy. It was a teacher. Every challenge carried information. Every difficult experience revealed something about the way the mind worked. Instead of running from discomfort, he believed it should be examined. That perspective changes everything because it transforms fear from something to avoid into something to learn from. The moment discomfort is viewed differently, it loses much of its power. It no longer becomes a wall standing in your way. It becomes a doorway, asking whether you are willing to step through it. That is why walking away can feel so unsettling in the beginning. It removes the distractions that once occupied your attention. Suddenly there are no more excuses to analyze, no more signs to interpret, no more endless attempts to predict someone else's intentions. What remains is silence, and within that silence, reality begins to reveal itself. Reality is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with a grand announcement. It appears quietly, often in moments when the mind finally stops resisting what has been obvious all along. You begin noticing patterns you previously ignored. You begin recognizing truths you once explained away. The behavior that confused you starts making sense. The mixed signals become clearer. The uncertainty that kept you trapped begins to dissolve, because uncertainty often survives only when reality is constantly being rewritten to fit hope. Hope can be beautiful when it inspires growth, but it becomes dangerous when it prevents acceptance. Many people become attached not to who someone is, but to who they imagine that person could become. They invest in potential while ignoring reality. They build emotional futures around possibilities rather than evidence. The mind fills in gaps, creates explanations, and searches for reasons to remain optimistic. Yet reality continues operating according to its own rules. Eventually, there comes a point where the difference between what is and what could be becomes impossible to ignore. Walking away forces that confrontation. It removes the distance between reality and perception. The illusion loses its strength because it can no longer be constantly reinforced. As clarity grows stronger, another realization begins to emerge. You start noticing how much authority you gave away without realizing it. The approval of another person influenced your confidence. Their attention influenced your mood. Their choices influenced how you viewed yourself. Little by little, pieces of your self-worth became connected to factors beyond your control. This happens so gradually that many people never notice it while it is occurring. Only after stepping back do they see the pattern clearly. They recognize how often they sought reassurance. They recognize how frequently they questioned their own value based on someone else's behavior. What once felt normal suddenly appears deeply unbalanced. This is where the cycle truly begins to break. Not when someone notices your absence, not when circumstances suddenly improve, not when another person changes their behavior. The cycle breaks when you stop measuring your value through external responses and begin measuring it through your own standards. That shift is subtle at first, but its effects are profound. The need for constant validation weakens. The fear of uncertainty loses its grip, and in place of that fear, something stronger begins to emerge, a quiet confidence rooted in reality rather than approval. That realization changes everything because it exposes a truth that is often hidden beneath daily habits and emotional routines. The moment you recognize that your sense of worth has become tied to another person's attention, you begin to see how much influence they have been holding over your inner world. Most people never make this connection immediately. They simply notice the symptoms. Their mood rises when they receive attention and falls when they do not. They feel secure when they are acknowledged and uncertain when they are ignored. Over time, this pattern becomes so familiar that it feels normal. Yet there is nothing normal about allowing another person's behavior to determine how you see yourself. The moment that understanding becomes clear, it is difficult to look at things the same way again. What once seemed like affection starts to reveal traces of dependence. What once seemed like connection begins to show signs of attachment. And in that awareness, something important begins to shift. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on self-mastery. They understood that genuine strength does not come from influencing others. It comes from governing yourself. As Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Anyone can feel calm when circumstances cooperate. Anyone can feel confident when they receive constant validation. The real challenge begins when those things disappear. What remains then? What remains when approval is removed, when expectations are unmet, and when reality refuses to follow the script the mind had written? The Stoics believed that character reveals itself in those moments. Not because hardship is desirable, but because hardship exposes what comfort often conceals. It reveals where confidence is rooted. It reveals whether peace depends on external conditions or something deeper. As that distance grows, something interesting starts to happen. The need for reassurance becomes less intense. The urge to seek validation begins to weaken, not all at once, but gradually, day by day, thought by thought. The mind starts remembering that it is capable of stability without constant confirmation from others. This process is subtle. It rarely arrives with dramatic breakthroughs or sudden transformations. More often it appears through small moments of clarity. You notice yourself thinking less about someone who once occupied your attention constantly. You notice yourself focusing more on your own priorities. You notice that situations which once triggered anxiety now feel manageable. These changes may seem small, but they represent something profound. They represent the return of inner authority. What makes this even more interesting is that other people often notice the change as well. Not because you announce it, not because you explain it, but because behavior always communicates more than words. When someone is desperate for attention, that desperation tends to reveal itself in subtle ways. It appears in excessive effort. It appears in over-explaining. It appears in the constant need for reassurance. Most people may not consciously identify these behaviors, but they feel them. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to emotional signals. They notice uncertainty. They notice neediness. They notice when someone is seeking validation rather than expressing confidence. The opposite is also true. They notice when that need disappears. This is why absence often creates a stronger impression than presence. Not because absence is inherently powerful, but because it changes the emotional dynamic. The energy shifts. The constant pursuit stops. The effort to secure attention disappears. In its place comes something calmer and far more stable: certainty. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when a person stops trying to convince others of their value. That confidence does not demand recognition. It does not seek approval. It simply exists. And because it exists without forcing itself upon others, it often becomes more noticeable than all the effort that came before it. People naturally respond differently to certainty than they do to desperation. Certainty feels grounded. Desperation feels unstable. Certainty communicates self-respect. Desperation communicates dependence. One invites respect. The other often diminishes it. This does not happen because people are cruel. It happens because confidence and neediness create entirely different psychological experiences. One suggests abundance. The other suggests scarcity. One comes from a belief that value already exists. The other comes from a fear that value must constantly be earned. That distinction influences every interaction, whether people are aware of it or not. That is why stepping back changes the dynamic in ways that many people fail to anticipate. The moment you stop filling every silence, something shifts. The conversations that once flowed automatically are no longer guaranteed. The attention that once appeared effortlessly is no longer constant. The explanations that once arrived whenever they were expected are no longer there. Suddenly there is room to think, room to notice, room to reflect. In many cases, people do not fully understand the role someone played in their life until that role is no longer being performed. What once felt ordinary begins to feel significant. What once felt permanent begins to feel uncertain. Human beings often become aware of value through contrast, and absence creates one of the strongest forms of contrast that exists. Modern psychology refers to part of this process as scarcity. When access to something becomes limited, people often pay closer attention to it. They begin assigning greater significance to what was previously taken for granted. This principle appears throughout human behavior. It influences how people view opportunities, experiences, possessions, and relationships. Yet long before psychologists studied these patterns, careful observers of human nature had already noticed them. The Stoics understood that availability affects perception. They recognized that constant explanation can reduce impact while restraint can increase it. Not because silence is a strategy for manipulation, but because silence changes where attention is directed. Instead of focusing outward, attention turns inward. Reflection begins where noise ends. This is one reason the Stoics valued restraint so highly. They understood that not every situation deserves an immediate response. Not every criticism requires a defense. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. The impulse to explain everything often comes from a desire to control how others perceive us. Yet perception remains outside our control no matter how carefully we manage it. A person can explain themselves perfectly and still be misunderstood. They can offer complete honesty and still face doubt. Once this reality is accepted, a tremendous amount of unnecessary effort begins to disappear. The need to constantly justify yourself weakens because you recognize that understanding cannot be forced. It can only be offered. Many people spend years exhausting themselves through endless explanation. They believe that if they just find the right words, the right timing, or the right approach, everything will finally make sense. Yet some situations remain unchanged, regardless of how much effort is invested. The explanation becomes longer, the misunderstanding remains, the defense becomes stronger, the judgment remains. Eventually, there comes a point where continuing the cycle serves no meaningful purpose. Silence enters not as surrender, but as wisdom. It is the recognition that energy is limited and should be directed toward what can actually be influenced. There is strength in knowing when to speak. There is equal strength in knowing when not to. This does not mean becoming distant from everyone or refusing communication altogether. That would miss the point entirely. Silence is powerful because it is intentional, not because it is permanent. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. It is the ability to remain composed without feeling compelled to react to every situation. It is the confidence to let some things exist without immediate correction. It is the discipline to resist explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they wish to believe. The goal is not withdrawal from life. The goal is freedom from unnecessary struggle. Once that distinction becomes clear, silence begins to feel less like absence and more like control. Something else starts happening during this process. The focus gradually shifts away from other people's reactions and toward your own possibilities. As long as attention remains fixed on how someone else feels about your departure, part of the old dependency remains alive. The mind is still looking outward for confirmation. It is still measuring progress through someone else's response. True change begins when that focus turns elsewhere. Instead of wondering what others are thinking, you begin considering what your newfound space allows you to build. Instead of analyzing reactions, you begin examining opportunities. The energy that once fueled worry starts becoming available for growth. This shift is subtle, but its effects are significant. Time that was once spent overthinking becomes available for learning. Emotional energy that was once spent seeking reassurance becomes available for self-development. Attention that was once consumed by uncertainty becomes available for purpose. These changes rarely happen overnight. They emerge gradually as the mind adjusts to a different way of operating. Yet each small adjustment contributes to a larger transformation. The dependence weakens, the clarity strengthens, the constant need for external confirmation slowly gives way to something more stable. As that stability develops, a surprising realization often appears. The greatest benefit of walking away was never the impact it had on someone else. The greatest benefit was the space it created within you. Space to think more clearly, space to see more honestly, space to reconnect with priorities that had been neglected. In that space, growth becomes possible, not because circumstances suddenly become easier, but because your attention is finally directed towards something that can truly be shaped. And once that attention begins moving inward instead of outward, a new chapter quietly begins to unfold, one defined not by what was lost, but by what can now be built. Many people underestimate how much energy is spent managing emotional uncertainty. They think only of the obvious actions, the messages sent, the conversations revisited, the moments of hesitation. What often goes unnoticed is the constant background activity taking place inside the mind, the repeated thoughts, the imagined scenarios, the endless effort to predict outcomes that cannot be controlled. All of that consumes energy, day after day, week after week, sometimes for years. When that cycle finally ends, the difference can feel remarkable. The mind becomes lighter, not because every problem disappears, but because a significant burden is no longer being carried. The attention that was once directed towards someone else's decisions becomes available for your own life again. This is where genuine transformation often begins. Not in dramatic moments that make for compelling stories, not in confrontations filled with emotional declarations. Real change tends to happen quietly. It happens when a person decides to wake up a little earlier. It happens when they commit to learning something new. It happens when they stop investing energy into outcomes they cannot control and start investing it into actions they can. These moments rarely attract attention from others, yet they shape the future in powerful ways. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed that character was not built through occasional bursts of motivation, but through repeated acts of discipline. Every action leaves an impression. Every choice contributes to the person you are becoming. That perspective changes how progress is viewed. Growth stops being something abstract and becomes something measurable. A completed workout is evidence. A new skill developed over time is evidence. A difficult habit replaced with a better one is evidence. These small victories may seem insignificant when viewed individually, but together they create momentum. The mind begins recognizing that life is moving forward. Confidence grows not because someone offered reassurance, but because action created proof. There is a unique strength that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself. It is different from praise, different from validation, different from approval. It is quieter, but it lasts much longer because it is rooted in experience rather than opinion. As this process continues, something else begins to change. The emotional influence that others once held starts to weaken. Their opinions still exist, but they no longer carry the same weight. Their approval may still feel pleasant, but it is no longer necessary. Their absence may still be noticed, but it is no longer devastating. The center of gravity shifts. Instead of constantly looking outward for confirmation, you begin looking inward for direction. This shift is subtle enough that many people do not recognize it immediately. They simply notice that situations which once consumed their attention no longer have the same effect. The things that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. The mind becomes less reactive and more deliberate. One reason this happens is because purpose naturally competes with preoccupation. The more engaged you become in building your own future, the less space remains for endless rumination. A person working toward meaningful goals has less time to obsess over unanswered questions. A person committed to self-improvement has less interest in chasing validation. The focus changes, the priorities change, even perception changes. What once looked like rejection begins to look different. Instead of viewing it as evidence of personal inadequacy, it begins to appear as redirection. A path closing creates room for another path to open. An ending creates space for a beginning that could not have emerged otherwise. This realization carries a certain freedom with it, not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because your relationship with disappointment changes. Disappointment loses much of its power when it is no longer interpreted as a statement about your worth. Circumstances become information rather than judgment. Setbacks become lessons rather than verdicts. The need to personalize every outcome begins to fade. This creates resilience because resilience is not built through avoiding difficulty. It is built through changing how difficulty is understood. The Stoics often return to this principle. Events themselves are rarely the source of suffering. The meaning assigned to them often matters far more. As that understanding deepens, standards naturally begin to rise. Not out of arrogance, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Once you recognize the value of your attention, you become more careful about where it is invested. Once you understand how much energy is required to build a meaningful life, you become less willing to waste that energy on situations that repeatedly diminish it. Selectivity emerges naturally from self-respect. There is no need to force it. There is no need to announce it. It simply becomes difficult to give unlimited access to people who consistently fail to value what they are receiving. This is one of the quiet rewards of growth. The more secure you become within yourself, the less pressure you feel to keep everyone in your life. Connections are no longer maintained out of fear. They are maintained out of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine appreciation. The need for constant validation continues fading into the background. In its place appears something far more stable, a growing sense of confidence that does not depend on who stays, who leaves, who approves, or who understands. And from that place of stability, the quality of every future relationship begins to change. As a person grows more secure within themselves, another lesson begins to reveal its importance. Growth alone is not enough. Clarity alone is not enough. There must also be limits. There must be a point where a person decides what they will accept and what they will no longer tolerate. This is where many people struggle because boundaries are often misunderstood. Some see them as barriers designed to keep others away. Some see them as signs of coldness or emotional distance. Others fear that setting limits will make them appear selfish. Yet healthy boundaries are none of those things. They are not punishments. They are not weapons. They are standards. They are quiet decisions about how your time, energy, and attention will be treated. Without those standards, even the strongest intentions eventually begin to erode. Many people spend years trying to be understanding. They make excuses for behavior that repeatedly disappoints them. They tell themselves that patience is always the answer. They convince themselves that being accommodating is the same thing as being kind. While kindness is valuable, there is a point where kindness without boundaries becomes self-neglect. As Seneca observed, he who respects himself is safe. Every time someone ignores their own needs to maintain another person's comfort, a subtle message is sent, not only to others, but to themselves. That message says that preserving harmony matters more than preserving self-respect. Over time, this pattern becomes difficult to sustain. Resentment begins to grow. frustration begins to build. The person may continue smiling on the surface, but internally they feel increasingly disconnected from their own values. Without boundaries, access becomes unlimited, and when access becomes unlimited, appreciation often declines. This is not because people are inherently ungrateful. It is because familiarity can create assumptions. When someone is always available, their presence starts to feel guaranteed. Their effort becomes expected rather than valued. Their patience becomes something others rely on without considering its cost. Gradually, the balance shifts. One person continues giving while the other continues receiving. The arrangement may continue for a long time, but eventually the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. At that point, a choice must be made. Continue reinforcing the pattern or establish a limit that changes it. Walking away is often one of those limits, not because it is dramatic, but because it communicates something clearly. It demonstrates that access is not automatic. It demonstrates that respect matters. It demonstrates that there are consequences when a relationship consistently moves in one direction while giving little in return. The important thing is that this decision does not require anger. Many people assume boundaries must be announced through confrontation or defended through emotional arguments. In reality, the strongest boundaries are often the quietest. They are expressed through action rather than explanation. A person simply stops participating in what repeatedly harms them. They stop investing where there is no reciprocity. They stop making exceptions that continuously undermine their own well-being. This approach requires discipline because it often feels uncomfortable at first. There is a natural temptation to explain every decision. There is a desire to ensure everyone understands your reasons, yet understanding is not always necessary for a boundary to remain valid. One of the most liberating realizations a person can have is that they do not need universal approval in order to make healthy choices. Some people will misunderstand, some will disagree, some may even criticize the decision. None of those reactions change the fact that a limit was needed. The Stoics frequently emphasized that other people's opinions belong to them, not to you. Once that principle is understood, maintaining boundaries becomes much easier because the focus shifts away from external reactions and back toward internal alignment. Something remarkable begins happening when this practice becomes consistent. The need to constantly defend your decisions starts fading. Confidence grows through repetition. Every time you uphold a standard, you strengthen trust in yourself. Every time you follow through on a boundary, you prove that your well-being matters. These moments may seem small, but they accumulate. Over time, they create a stronger relationship with yourself. The voice that once doubted every decision becomes quieter. The fear of disappointing others loses much of its influence. In its place emerges a calm certainty that is difficult to shake. As this certainty grows, experiences that once felt painful begin to feel different. Time spent alone no longer carries the same emotional weight. In the past, solitude may have felt like evidence that something was missing. It may have felt uncomfortable because attention was still directed toward what had been lost. Now the perspective changes. Solitude becomes an opportunity rather than a punishment. It becomes space to think clearly, act intentionally, and reconnect with priorities that may have been neglected. Instead of feeling empty, that space begins to feel valuable. This transformation does not happen overnight. It develops gradually through repeated choices. A person learns that peace is easier to maintain when access is earned rather than automatically granted. They learn that self-respect grows when actions align with values. Most importantly, they discover that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Loneliness comes from feeling disconnected from meaning. Solitude, when approached with intention, creates the opposite effect. It strengthens connection with yourself. And when that connection becomes strong enough, something extraordinary occurs. The silence that once felt uncomfortable starts feeling powerful. And the independence that once seemed intimidating starts feeling like freedom. This is a lesson that many people spend years learning, and some never fully learn it at all. The ability to enjoy your own company is one of the greatest forms of freedom a person can develop. Yet in a world that constantly encourages distraction, constant connection, and endless validation, many people become uncomfortable the moment they are left alone with themselves. Silence feels heavy. Empty time feels unsettling. The absence of attention feels like something is missing. Because of this, countless people remain attached to relationships, situations, and environments that no longer serve them. Not because those things bring them peace, but because they help them avoid facing the discomfort of solitude. The irony is that the very thing they are avoiding often contains the growth they are looking for. What appears to be emptiness is often space. What appears to be loneliness is often an opportunity to build a stronger relationship with yourself. The moment a person becomes comfortable being alone, a significant shift begins to occur. Decisions become clearer. Standards become stronger. Fear loses much of its influence. When someone desperately needs companionship to feel complete, they become vulnerable to accepting almost anything in exchange for attention. They overlook disrespect. They ignore warning signs. They make excuses for behavior that contradicts their values. The desire to avoid loneliness becomes stronger than the desire to protect their well-being. This is why so many people remain trapped in unhealthy patterns for far longer than they should. They are not staying because the situation is fulfilling. They are staying because the alternative feels uncertain. Yet uncertainty becomes far less intimidating when a person discovers that their own company is not something to fear. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Despite carrying enormous responsibilities, he often returned to the idea that peace could be found within, not in circumstances, not in approval, not in external achievements, within. He recognized that life is constantly changing. People enter your life and leave it. Relationships evolve, opportunities appear and disappear, public opinion shifts. What feels permanent today may look completely different a year from now. The one thing that remains throughout all of those changes is the person you become. That understanding creates a very different perspective on loss. Instead of measuring life by what leaves, you begin measuring it by what remains. Character remains, wisdom remains, discipline remains, the lessons gained through experience remain. Everything else is temporary. As this perspective develops, the need to hold on to people at all costs begins to weaken. You stop viewing every departure as a disaster. You stop interpreting every ending as evidence of failure. Instead, you begin seeing relationships more clearly. Some people are meant to stay for a season. Some are meant to stay much longer. Some serve a purpose for a specific chapter of life and then move on. Resisting this reality often creates unnecessary suffering. Accepting it creates peace. Acceptance does not mean becoming detached from everyone. It means understanding that your well-being cannot depend entirely on circumstances that are constantly changing. It means learning how to appreciate people without making them responsible for your happiness. This is where many people discover a deeper form of confidence. Not the confidence that comes from attention or praise, but the confidence that comes from self-sufficiency. There is something powerful about knowing that your sense of worth remains intact, regardless of who stays or leaves. It changes the way you move through life. You become less reactive, less anxious, less desperate for reassurance. Relationships stop feeling like necessities and start feeling like choices. You no longer approach people from a place of lack. You approach them from a place of abundance. The difference may not always be visible on the surface, but it changes everything beneath it. This is also why walking away often affects people more than they expect. Many assume that loyalty guarantees unlimited access. They assume that someone who has always been available will continue being available no matter how they are treated. Over time, they stop questioning that assumption because it becomes part of their reality. The effort remains consistent. The patience remains consistent. The availability remains consistent. Eventually, they begin treating those things as permanent features rather than valuable gifts. Then something changes. The person they assumed would always remain begins choosing themselves instead, not through anger, not through conflict, simply through quiet action. They stop participating in situations that no longer align with their values. That shift often surprises people because it challenges expectations that had gone unquestioned for a very long time. The surprise does not come from hostility, it comes from contrast. Someone who was once always available is no longer available. Someone who once tolerated everything no longer tolerates it. Someone who once prioritized everyone else's comfort begins prioritizing their own well-being. This creates a reality that others must adjust to. In many cases, they never believed such a change was possible. They assumed familiarity would continue indefinitely. They assumed effort would continue regardless of how little appreciation was shown. When those assumptions collapse, they are forced to confront something they had previously ignored. What they confront is not punishment. It is reality. The reality that no person is obligated to remain where they are not valued. The reality that loyalty does not require self-sacrifice. The reality that patience has limits. Most importantly, it reveals that self-respect eventually changes behavior. A person who truly values themselves cannot endlessly accept situations that diminish their peace. At some point, action becomes necessary. Not because they wish to hurt anyone, but because growth demands it. The most powerful part is that none of this requires dramatic announcements, no lengthy explanations, no attempts to prove a point. The message is communicated through behavior alone. Choosing yourself becomes the statement. Continuing forward becomes the statement. Building a meaningful life regardless of who understands becomes the statement. And in that quiet decision, something remarkable happens. The person who once feared being alone discovers they were never truly alone at all. They were simply waiting to become someone whose own presence was enough. In the end, the greatest victory is not making someone regret losing you. The greatest victory is becoming someone who no longer needs that regret to move forward. Real strength is quiet. Real confidence is steady. And real freedom begins the moment your peace stops depending on what others choose to do. Keep choosing growth. Keep choosing self-respect. Keep choosing the path that leads back to yourself. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal. If this message resonated with you, stay with that momentum and watch one of the videos on your screen right now. It may be the next step in your journey toward greater clarity, discipline, and inner strength. Until next time, take care and keep moving forward.